postmortem, however, would never come. In January 1947, a horrific tragedy occurred. At the age of 22, Elizabeth was brutally murdered in Los Angeles. Elizabeth, or Betty as she was commonly known, was born July 29, 1924, in Medford, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 girls born within 8 years of Phoebe Short and her husband Cleo, who built miniature golf courses. After the stock market crash and the beginning of the Depression, Cleo abandoned the family, vanishing in 1930 when Betty was 6. She suffered from asthma and had a scar on her back from the surgery for empyema, a scar that would clinch the identification of her body years later. Betty Short's schoolmates recall her as a nice, attractive girl who turned heads whenever she walked down the street or entered into the Medford Cafe, a local cafeteria. Bob Pacios, who grew up around the corner from the Shorts' home on Salem Street, remembers Betty as by far the prettiest of the 5 sisters. Pacios said she liked to tease him. She knew I was bashful and liked to see my face turn crimson. She would say, "We ought to go out dancing together." But she was a nice girl, he said. Pacios tells of a friend who dated her a few times, but never even kissed her. She wouldn't let him, he said. She had an unusual walk, Pacios said. It was almost a mincing type thing. I think she could have balanced a book on her head. She glided. She walked like a model on a runway. Elizabeth was an indifferent student at Medford High School, getting C's and D's, and she quit school after her freshman year. The family decided to send her to Florida to spare her the harsh New England winters. It was 1940 and she was 16. After a few winters in Florida, she tried California. At one point she was living in Santa Barbara, but got sent back to Medford by juvenile authorities. A crime scene. At around 10 a.m. on January 15th, 1947, Betty Bersinger was pushing her daughter in a stroller through the Lamette Park section of South Los Angeles when something caught her eye amongst the weedy vacant lots. A naked female body, severed at the waist, was lying just off the sidewalk, the stark whiteness of her skin offset by jet black hair and deformities such as the gashes carved from each side of her mouth. The body was posed in such a way that upon arrival the police reportedly thought it was just a mannequin at first glance. Despite the extensive mutilation and cuts on the body, there was no blood at the scene. The killer had completely drained the corpse of blood and scrubbed it clean. The police quickly identified the body after getting blurred fingerprints via a sound photo, which was a primitive fax machine used by news services in LA. The young woman turned out to be Elizabeth Short, nicknamed by acquaintances as the Black Dahlia, due to her penchant for sheer black dresses and for the Blue Dahlia movie out at the time. Short's prints appeared twice in the FBI's database, first because she had applied for a job as a clerk at an army base in California, second because she had been arrested by the Santa Barbara police for underage drinking 7 months later. The Bureau also had her mugshot in its files and provided that to the press. An autopsy found that the victim had died from repeated blows to the face and the subsequent blood loss from those gashes. The torso's bisection and other mutilations were then made after she was already dead. In San Diego, reporters found a family who took Short into their home in late 1946 when she as she got in the car, Manley said. He reportedly arranged a job interview for her, but she never showed up. They went out 4 nights in a row before he headed back to his wife and young son in LA. After the holidays, the family asked her to leave, so she asked Manley to come and get her. She told him she was going to meet her sister, Virginia, and go up to Berkeley, none of which was true. Investigators apprehended Robert Manley, who had dropped her off at LA's Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, which was the date of her last sighting. Manley later identified one of the victim's shoes and a purse found near the crime scene, but his alibi is otherwise checked out. He passed a polygraph test, and so was cleared of any wrongdoing. The police ran record checks on potential suspects and conducted interviews across the nation. Based on early suspicions that the murderer may have had skills in dissection because the body was so cleanly cut, agents investigated a group of students at the University of Southern California Medical School. In late January, 10 days after the murder, an envelope labelled with cut-out words and the phrase, "Heaven is here," arrived at the examiner's office. Inside was a collection of Schultz's personal documents, including her birth certificate, social security card, and an address book belonging to a Mark Hansen, his name written on the cover. It was later said that Elizabeth was using it as her own, despite Hansen's name being on the cover. Hansen confirmed that Schultz had rented a room in his nightclub, an explanation that fit in with her developing profile as a drifter, and he was soon crossed off the suspect list. Decades later, when interviewed, Hansen said he never liked her. She was a man-crazy tramp, but she wasn't a prostitute, Hansen said. There were all kinds of men in her life, but we were only able to find 3 who had any sexual experience with her, Hansen said. She was a tease. She gave a bad time to quite a few guys. She just asked for trouble. There wasn't very much to like about her. She probably went too far this time and just set some guy off into a blind, berserk rage. Police tracked down approximately 75 men from the address book, most of whom had only briefly met Elizabeth. The men told similar stories. They met Betty Short on a corner or at a bus stop. They went out for a meal or to a nightclub. She might have asked them for money under the pretense of having difficulties cashing a check. Nothing romantic ever occurred, and they never saw her again. Dozens of confessions poured in from around the country, and all were disproved. Authorities sifted through copycat letters from the alleged killer and were following up on other crimes that could potentially be related, including the Red Lipstick murder and the Cleveland Torso murders. But eventually they found themselves back to square one. One suspect was Leslie Dillion. Dillion was a 27-year-old bellhop, aspiring writer, and former mortician's assistant, who became a suspect when he began writing to LA Police Department psychiatrist Dr. Paul DeRiver. In October 1948, Dillion was living in Florida at the time of his correspondence with DeRiver, but had formerly lived in LA. He read a story about the case in a True Detective-style magazine, in which DeRiver was quoted, and wrote to DeRiver regarding his theories on the case. In his correspondence, he mentioned an intense interest in sadism and sexual violence, in hopes of authoring a book on the subject. Dillion offered up one of his friends, Jeff Connors, as a likely suspect. Over the course of their correspondence, DeRiver began to believe that Connors did not actually exist, and that Dillion had committed the murder himself. In December of 1948, Las Vegas, Nevada. Dillion expressed reservations about LA and chose Las Vegas instead. The river and undercover LAPD officers met Dillion in Las Vegas for a couple of days and then proceeded to drive back to California. Once there, Dillion and the river traveled to San Francisco to unsuccessfully look for Connors. When Dillion offered up intimate details about the crime, he was then taken into custody by the undercover officers and transported to Los Angeles. After this happened, Dillion threw a postcard out of a hotel window with a plea for help on it. It was discovered by a passerby and turned in to the local authorities. Police soon discovered that Connors did indeed exist. His real name was Artie Lane. Lane had lived in LA at the time of the murder and was employed by Columbia Studios, a favourite hangout of Elizabeth's, as a maintenance man. However, contrary to popular belief, Dillion could not be conclusively placed in San Francisco at the time of the murder. In fact, police could never account for Dillion's whereabouts between January 9th and January 15th, 1947. Dillion later filed a $100,000 claim against the city of Los Angeles, but dropped the lawsuit after it emerged he was wanted by Santa Monica police for robbery. An expert profiler, John Douglas, suggested the following profile for the killer. He was a white man, no younger than his late 20s, and possibly older, with a high school education. He lived alone, made his living working with his hands rather than his brains. He was adept with a knife and was comfortable with blood. For example, a butcher, a slaughterhouse worker, or possibly a hunter who knew how to dress deer. The killer was familiar with prostitutes. He was rigid, patient, compulsive, and deliberate. He drank alcohol, and when he was drunk he became argumentative. He probably had a police record for either threatening or assaulting someone with a knife. The killer was under great personal and financial stress, like one of the Southland butchers taking part in the 6-week strike that lasted all through Christmas and New Year's. He and Short spent several days together. He had been drinking. Maybe he had a physical handicap or stuttered, and Short made fun of it. But she rejected him. The mixture of personal stress, alcohol, and rejection exploded into murderous rage. Cutting the body in half was simply to make transportation easier, Douglas said, but a level of mutilation reflects a personal rage directed at Elizabeth. He was dehumanizing her and defeminizing her, and then he cuts that smile into her face, Douglas said. You can just imagine him saying, "You bitch, look who has the last laugh now." But why Norton Avenue? Douglas noted that there were far better places to dispose of a body in the Southland where it would have never been found. The mountains, a desert, even the ocean. Instead of a broad, flat area that was visible for blocks in all directions. The killer took a high risk to place the body where he did, Douglas said, because he wanted to put the fear of God into that neighborhood. Under the influence of alcohol, he was drawn to that area. He must have had some connection to the neighborhood, Douglas said. The killer might have suffered a financial setback when housing construction was halted because of the war. Maybe he used to play baseball there, or worked in a building that was torn down to make way for housing. Whatever the reason, Norton Avenue was a deliberate choice. A suspect that fit this role was Walter Bayley. Walter Bayley was very much like the profile given by John Douglas. He was desensitized to blood, he was comfortable with a knife, and although he had a medical degree, he did work with his hands rather than his brains. He also had a link to the immediate vicinity of the crime. In the mid-1940s, professor of surgery at the University of Southern California. He also maintained an active private practice at the professional building 1052 West 6th Street, only 5 blocks away from the Biltmore Hotel. He and his wife Ruth had recently bought a home at 3959 South Norton Avenue, just 1 block from where Betty's body was found. However, his life had begun to unravel in the last few years. By 1946, he was no longer chief of staff at County Hospital or associate professor of surgery at USC. Because he was no longer in these positions, there was new financial stress. Because he was earning less money, he had an affair with a younger doctor, Alexandra von Partika. In October 1946, Walter walked out on his family, who remained at the house on South Norton Avenue, and filed for divorce. A few weeks before he died on January 4th, 1948, Walter wrote a new will, in which he left everything to Alexandra. Because the divorce had not become final, Ruth remained his wife, and she brought a lawsuit against his estate. She accused that Alexandra had learned a secret about Walter that would ruin him if it were to become public, and that whenever he tried to return to his family, Alexandra would threaten to reveal his secret. Since there is no confessions, we can't say Walter was the killer, but the fact remains that Walter's daughter knew Betty's sister and brother-in-law, that Betty's murder showed medical finesse, and that Walter Bayley was an expert surgeon who fits many traits listed in a profile of a hypothetical killer. So the theory is this: Betty was broke when she arrived at the Biltmore Hotel with Robert Manley. It was late. She had nowhere to stay and little money for food. It isn't hard to imagine that under those circumstances she would reach out for help to a friend of the family, a doctor, a member of her brother-in-law's church. There is the possibility that she had contacted Walter Bayley at any time during her 6 months in Los Angeles. Walter could have been accommodating, and his office was only a few blocks away, an easy walk. They spent a few days together, then something went wrong. Perhaps there was, as John Douglas suggests, a seduction in progress, and she rejected him, as she had so many other men. Only this time with a combination of financial and emotional stress, plus Walter's declining mental faculties, all fueled with alcohol and anger at his wife, who was living at 3959 South Norton Avenue. He exploded in a murderous rage. He had found a way to put the fear of God into that neighborhood. Afterward, he would be certain that no one would ever connect him to the killing, because the link between his daughter and Betty's sister was so obscure. He was enjoying the publicity, and even mailed some of Betty's things to the Examiner just to keep the publicity rolling. When interviewed, people would recall Walter Bayley as a gentleman, a fine surgeon, and a good family man. However, the people who recall him from his final years frequently express surprise at the transformation he underwent as his mental impairment increased. Bayley's neurodegenerative condition was known to produce violent behavior in otherwise passive individuals. His surgical specialization included mastectomies, hysterectomies, and the surgical removal of fat. Bayley's former receptionist remarked that at dinner time, he and his mistress would watch movies of surgeries and autopsies. Another possible suspect was Dr. George Hill Hodel Jr., who came under police scrutiny in October 1949, when his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar, accused him of molesting her. Despite 3 witnesses testifying they had seen Hodel having sex with Tamar, he was acquitted in December 1949. The trial led the LAPD to include Hodel, thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary, Hodel said in February 18th, 1950. The secretary he referred to was Ruth Spaulding, who police had previously suspected of being murdered by Hodel in 1945. He was present when Spaulding overdosed and had burnt some of her papers before police were called. The case was dropped owing to a lack of evidence, but documents were later found that indicated Spaulding was about to publicly accuse Hodel of intentionally misdiagnosing patients and then billing them for laboratory tests, medical treatment, and prescriptions they didn't need. Hodel's son, former LAPD homicide detective Steve Hodel, believes that Elizabeth may have been one of his father's patients. However, upon investigation, the police could not find any links between Hodel and Elizabeth. Another suspect was Patrick S. O'Reilly. According to Los Angeles District Attorney files, Dr. Patrick O'Reilly was a medical doctor who knew Short through nightclub owner Mark Hansen. According to the file, at the time of the murder, O'Reilly was a good friend of Hansen and frequented Hansen's nightclub. Files also state that O'Reilly attended sex parties at Malibu with Hansen. O'Reilly had a history of sexually motivated violent crime. He had been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon for taking his secretary to a motel and sadistically beating her almost to death, apparently for no reason other than to satisfy his sexual desires without intercourse. Furthermore, the files indicate that O'Reilly's right pectoral had been surgically removed, which investigators found similar to the mutilation of Elizabeth's body. The file indicates that O'Reilly had once been married to the daughter of an LAPD captain. Another theory accuses the filmmaker Orson Welles as a suspect. Mary Pachios, a former neighbor of the Short family in Medford, Massachusetts, suggested Orson Welles as a suspect. Pachios bases this theory on such factors as Welles' volatile temperament and his creation of mannequins 3 months before Short's death that supposedly featured lacerations that were virtually identical to those inflicted on Elizabeth Short. The mannequins were used in the House of Mirrors set for The Lady from Shanghai, a film that Welles was making with his ex-wife Rita Hayworth around the time of the murder. The scenes containing the set were deleted from the film by Harry Cohn. In one of Elizabeth's last letters to her home, her older sister Virginia claimed she had written that a movie director was going to give her a screen test. Pachios also cites Welles' familiarity with the site where the body was found and the magic act he performed to entertain soldiers during World War II. She believes that the bisection of the body was part of the killer's signature and an acting out of the perpetrator's obsession. Welles applied for his passport on January 24, 1947, the same day that the killer mailed a packet to Los Angeles newspapers. Welles left the country for an extended stay in Europe 10 months after the murder without completing the editing of Macbeth, the film he was both directing and starring in. Despite persistent attempts by Republic Pictures to get him to return to complete the film, he refused. According to Pachios, witnesses she had interviewed stated that Welles and the victim both frequented Brittingham Restaurant in Los Angeles during the same time period, and waitresses believed Elizabeth was going out with someone at Columbia Pictures. Welles was never a suspect in the police investigation. So, there are many more theories, but I just included the more notable ones and the more convincing ones, I thought. The case still remains open today, unsolved.